Hello and welcome everyone to this EES Spotlight lecture. I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural lecture by the new EES president on Egypt's identity in her Islamic arts. So this lecture falls within our wider theme of Visualising Egypt, which is exploring the diversity and complexity of Egyptian art and how it has inspired contemporary artists. So our speaker today will be dealing with two different aspects of Egyptian artistic identity under Islam: the survival of pre-Islamic motifs in Egyptian Islamic art and material culture, and on a more abstract level, the memory of her pre-Islamic past in Arabic texts. So to introduce our president, the president of the Egypt Exploration Society, I'm here with Professor Doris Behrens-Abouseif, who was the Nasser Khalili Chair of Islamic Art and Archaeology at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London from 2000 to 2014. She has published widely on the subjects of the history of Islamic architecture and decorative arts, cultural history, concepts of aesthetics and Orientalism, and is regarded around the world as the authority on Mamluk Egyptian history. Her work has also considered the role of ancient Egyptian architecture and its incorporation into Islamic monuments, as well as medieval accounts of Egypt's ancient past. Her grandfather was the Egyptian Egyptologist Hakim Abouseif, and she continues to explore her personal history through her research. She was elected president of the Egypt Exploration Society on the 26th of November 2022, and I am so happy to have you here with us, Doris, for this lecture. I'm sure we're all very excited to learn a lot more about Egypt under Islam. So thank you very much. Please do go ahead.
Thank you, Charlotte, for your very kind introduction, and I'm indeed pleased and honored to have the opportunity to reflect here with you about Egypt's identity to her Islamic art and material culture. It's a subject with multifacets. It's a complex subject also, and it is open to many interpretations. And as you have mentioned, I have made the choice of the subjects I'm going to, the points I want to refer to. It is material culture and the art, as well as the text, what text tells us, as well as popular beliefs. I mean, in Egypt, in Egypt, I have heard many times or read many times about saying Egypt has always swallowed its conquerors. It has always ascertained its own identity, no matter under which rule and who has dominated her. And there's this saying that Egypt, the graveyard of its conqueror is Maqbarat al-Ghuzat. Now, of course, this is an interesting question, and I thought of this when I saw recently in a film, in a documentary film, I saw an image of this relief. I think it is in the temple of Luxor, showing Alexander worshipping as a pharaoh. So this relief shows very well, embodies very well this idea that Egypt has absorbed, swallowed, whatever, its conquerors. So let's look at what we have here. Egypt, of course, I have often asked myself also about, the students very often have asked me about the survival or the impact of pre-Islamic Egypt in the Islamic period. And usually the questions refer to the Egypt of the pharaohs. Egypt had a great deal of pre-Islamic past, and there are many aspects and layers of their survival in the Islamic medieval period. And as you know, in late antiquity and early Christianity, Egypt art was a Coptic art which combined Christian and indigenous with Mediterranean, Greco-Roman, and Byzantine elements. Under Arab Muslim rule, Egypt came in the early history was a province under the Umayyad with capital Damascus, and the Abbasid in the Abbasid Empire with capital Baghdad and Samarra. Egypt adopted Islam and the Arabic language and script, and it followed in the early period the artistic trends set in the imperial capitals Damascus and Baghdad. However, material culture did not change radically and immediately at all levels. The survival of pre-Islamic artistic and material cultural tradition is a natural phenomenon of continuity, and it's not only in Egypt, but in all other provinces of the Muslim empire or any empire after the conquest. Not people do not begin to change everything and all what they do from the one day to the next, in particular in the lower level of everyday life and of commoners' life. Like, for example, here you see two lampstands. The one on the left side is pre-Islamic, it's difficult to date, it's the Roman, Byzantine, and the one on the right-hand side is evidently Fatimid, 10th, 11th, or 12th century. So you see a continuity, a survival with some modification over time. You have here Arabic. No, this one does not have Arabic script, but it could have had, and new design. But basically, it is the same concept. And this is just one example. One could bring several other examples of that kind. For example, in mosque architecture was something that belonged to the patrons, and it is the ruling establishment who designed, who planned the mosque, and of course was very much involved in the design. I'm talking here about the Mosque of Tulun, one of the most important and interesting mosques, and the oldest surviving its original shape in Egypt. And it was built in a time when Egypt was province of the Abbasid Empire by the local governor Ibn Tulun in the 9th century. And of course, it looked at the imperial model, and it was, in many respects, it reflects the architecture of the capital, which at that time when the mosque was built was Samarra, not Baghdad. If we forget the dome structure in the middle, which was added later on, you see that the mosque has a minaret, and indeed the architecture of this mosque is very much inspired by a prototype in Samarra. Brick architecture, the mosque was built on piers, and it has a minaret built outside the precinct of the mosque, which is has this very astonishing, usual spiral profile, and this is called the Malwiya. Of course, the Mosque of Tulun also is much smaller in terms of dimensions than the Abbasid prototype, but it has one feature which for me, it's already Egypt. It shows the Egyptian identity. The Mosque of Samarra is built entirely in brick. Brick is the building material of Mesopotamia in Iraq, and whereas Egypt has a very strong and very old tradition of stone architecture. And this is why we see at the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, the Malwiya, as it is called in of Samarra, has been turned into a structure of stone. However, forget the upper part, the top, which was added in the 14th century. We don't know exactly how in the late 13th century, we don't know exactly how the top here was. Perhaps it looked like the one here, but here it's already Egyptian. The local craftsmen, while interpreting the mosque, were adding something of their own, which is they say we can build this in stone. And indeed, the prayer niche of the mosque also has Egyptian features, which is the columns are pre-Islamic, evidently, and the capitals are also of the Coptic Byzantine tradition. These are the only columns. Apparently, the builder or the master builder may have been Christian, because a legend says he built the mosque without choosing any building material taken from churches, except just the two pair of columns here. In fact, the mosque was built without columns because it is like the one in Iraq, which was also built without columns. So there is already, even when copying a model, an imperial model in the province, there is still a little signature of local identity. Also, another thing which is very particular also in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, the soffits of its arches are based on geometrical design that one can find in Byzantine art, and of course, I see here, and you don't find that kind of design in the Iraqi Mesopotamian or Iraq or Samarran prototype, but this is, in my view, the survival of local Byzantine traditions in Egypt. Under the Fatimids, well, in the 10th century, 969, Egypt became part of the became Fatimid. The Fatimid Shia dynasty conquered Egypt, and Cairo was the capital now, not of a province as it had, but now the capital of a caliphate of its own, with its own imperial art and architecture and regal culture. And much of this culture now, it was no longer necessarily looking at prototypes outside. In other words, Cairo was the imperial capital of the Fatimids. And we know from Fatimid art in particular that the Copts played an important role, that is the local population. They were still occupied at that time a major place in terms also of number in Egypt, and Fatimid art has quite a few continuities from pre-Islamic, from Coptic Egypt. Most of all textile, and scholars of textile will have written a great deal about that. You see here a Coptic textile and a Fatimid textile of 11th century, and there's no doubt it is a direct continuity, except that we have the Arabic inscriptions. Also, the presence of the Copts was well attested and documented, and they had a role to play at the court and in the arts. Here, luster, this kind of ceramic, is a very special kind, which began in Egypt and in Iraq and in Egypt. It's a special technique of doing pottery, producing pottery with a metallic glitter, and the Fatimids have been very strong and very creative in this art of pottery. And here we have two examples where you see not only what it seems to be a Coptic priest or a Christian motifs, but also a very rare case of the cross taking shape, having the shape of the ancient Egyptian Ankh. This is very much Egyptian identity, surviving well into an imperial art like that of the lusterware. Besides this, we also have in many of the decorative arts of that period motifs that seem to be that have already been there and widespread in Coptic art. We have here a Coptic textile showing a winged horse, and we have a luster ceramic dish of the Fatimid period showing their interpretation of the winged horse, which is a masterpiece of ceramic art, and a marble panel also of the Fatimid period showing a winged horse, which could be a mixture between centaur and winged horse because it has a human figure. And yes, so the wing, and as we can see here, this winged horse has lots of parallels in Coptic art as well. We have here the Fatimid, so there is a continuity. But I want to show you a particular case which I've been looking at recently, and which is really enigmatic. It's an enigmatic group of objects, the Kilgas, about which very little is really known. There are a few articles, 3 articles written about them, and there's always this tendency, this idea that there's something pre-Islamic here. The one on the upper left hand is from the Coptic Museum and shows these are marble carved structures which collect the water, which are the basis of water jars. They would bear on top of them a water jar made of clay, and which filtered like the olla, which filtrate its water, the cool water, down to be collected in the kilga. This is what they are called. So the ones we see here are they're evidently Coptic and are most likely pre-Islamic, or perhaps done in the very early Islamic period, and they are Christian, made under anyway in a Christian Egypt. Other ones which work, the tradition continues, and we find some also with Islamic features like this one with mukarnas, as you can see, and Arabic good wishes. However, the iconography is very, very strange and enigmatic. Here we have a naked figure, female, raising her hands, and here you have a figure which would look like a priest holding something. The figure here could be interpreted, in fact, as pregnant. Here another one, also evidently done in the Islamic period, and you have again these naked figures here, like a female holding her breasts, and at the same time good wishes. Just a moment. And good wishes in Arabic, so no doubt that this very strange combination, rare combination of naked female figures combined with Arabic inscription. But evidently these figures are not just decorative, they must have a meaning, and some of them, as we can see here, have, we say, male or female raising their hand in devotional posture, figures that look like priests, and the kind of animals we are used to see also in Coptic art. The meaning of these figures have not been interpreted yet, but one can see that there's something like, perhaps it must be related to fertility and the pregnant women with water association. This is a topic that already appears in ancient Egypt: pregnancy, fertility, and water, and other figures that are not so easy to interpret. This kind of object, the kilga itself, its shape and its iconography, are something very Egyptian, exclusively Egyptian, which we find at this period, and the latest of them may have been done date to the early 13th century. Probably we have no evidence of later ones. They also carry, here you have a figure that looks like a pregnant female. Sometimes you cannot tell the face, and then mythological animals like winged lions, which are very frequent, of course, in classical art and pre-Islamic Mediterranean, Greco-Roman, Byzantine, etc. Art as well. So here we see, and like in this one, on this kilga, you have also something has been removed evidently here, two figures back to back, and another figure, well, like an enthroned person sitting here. Also the subject again here, and there's a subject of the fish, which is a very Coptic subject, appear quite often on these kilgas, also because they are related to water, and here a lion figure which almost look human. Another interesting subject, also another example of survival of pre-Islamic patterns well into the 11th and 12th century, is this marble panel in the Islamic Museum in Cairo, which has even the two figures which have the features of mermaids. We have seen these sirens, female birds, or female combined with bird features, and the winged horse I was talking about. All these are mythological figures, however, which they go back to pre-Islam. However, they are there. There's no doubt from the style of this panel that the carving comes from the Islamic period. So the one thing we notice about this object is that the survival, the continuity, the influence of pre-Islamic Egypt all comes from the immediate past, from the Greco-Roman, from the Hellenistic fusion culture of what Coptic Egypt was at the time of the Arab conquest, but it doesn't recall anything of ancient pharaonic Egypt. It is all the immediate past. And so is the case as well when we talk about another form of continuity of pre-Islamic, although it is the case of the reuse of building material in Islamic monuments. Of course, continuity is a bit, not everyone may accept the word, because an aspect of by removing building materials, columns and capital from earlier monuments, you are, of course, destroying the monuments or damaging them heavily, destroying, one would say. And yet, all we know, everybody knows, and in fact, and if you travel in provincial cities in Egypt, all the early mosques, and the first mosque in Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, which has changed substantially, was built, or they were all built with capital and columns taken from pre-Islamic monuments. And Egypt was full had a great past where, since the Greek period, such buildings, such columns were produced. Here, a case from the Mosque of Amr, but also the city of Mahalla, and especially in provincial town today, there are true museums for pre-Islamic classical columns. However, I mention this as a kind of continuity because these columns present a kind, they have been appropriated in the aesthetic of Islamic art. They are, you can see them. They have been also imitated when the builder wanted to build a mosque with a certain kind of columns, and there was somewhere, for the sake of symmetry, some pieces were missing, they were copied, and we know that there was a production and imitation of Corinthian and Coptic columns under Islam. That is, they were part of the aesthetic, they become part of the aesthetic of the mosque architecture, and with which the Muslim builders and patrons identified themselves. And in fact, they became, they were chosen with expertise. It is remarkable. This is the Mosque of Ulmas al-Nasiri, built in the 1330s in Cairo in the Mamluk period. And here at one of the corners, you see, of course, the columns had different heights depending from where they came, but there was an idea of putting the best ones in the corner so that you can see them best. They became part of the aesthetic program, and they were chosen and placed usually with quite a great deal of expertise. The patrons and had people who knew which one were the better ones, and the better ones were always placed in prominent places. So they became, I would say, they were in a way appropriated, and they were appreciated, so they become part of the Islamic design. Here at the complex of Qalawun in the late 13th century, just near the entrance, you have the most spectacular capitals, pre-Islamic, and then on the facade of the building, where you can see them best rather than inside, you have the highest quality of these columns. So they become part of the Islamic art itself. And in fact, as late as the early 16th century, under Sultan al-Ghuri, when he built his mosque, at the outside of the mosque, you have here, it's evidently not a real capital, it is a carved-in capital in the Coptic and the late classical style, the Coptic style, the Byzantine style with basket motif, and here as well, what you see even that the carving extends beyond the capital itself. So here it is part of the Islamic aesthetics to have this reconstructed column. Another type of continuity and reuse, but very different and purely utilitarian, was using building material from ancient Egyptian temples, the temples to use them for building construction. We know that the Fatimid walls and gates were built with stones that were taken from ancient Egyptian temples. And I think, if I'm not wrong, the Egyptologists know exactly, they have studied them and whatever is visible from them, and they can attribute them to specific temples. So usually, but here you do not see it, only when you are inside the gates. You can see sometimes traces of of ancient Egyptian motif. It has not, so the gates were built, tremendous amount of stones taken from temples. However, they were not shown. You could only the inside you can see, and we know that they were taken from temples, but there's no aesthetic appropriation here, as was the case with the Byzantine capitals, which were copied and continuous, and I suppose with pride displayed and showing the continuity. We are, or we can do as beautiful as the Byzantines did before us. And also another case of spolia, very, very strong, was during Salah ad-Din, the age of the Crusaders, when he built the citadel and walls of Cairo. We know that he dismantled a number of small pyramids in Giza, and to build the fortifications and the citadel of Cairo. And even more, there was, unfortunately, a huge, big monument of which nothing has survived, not even the memory. It was a big bridge, and this is a map of the 16th century by an Italian artist who made, this is the first real map of view of Cairo. It shows the pyramids of Giza here, the Giza Plateau, then here the Rauda Island, and here the city of Cairo. This is would be Fustat here, and then the citadel there. Very stylized, but very interesting, and it has all elements where they belong. And it shows here a big bridge going from the pyramid towards Giza, and then to the river and towards the island of Rhoda and Fustat. And we know from ancient sources this was a huge bridge or causeway leading indeed from the pyramids to Fustat. It crossed the Nile and it reached Fustat. And this was by Salah ad-Din and by his great viziers Karakush. It was a gigantic building, and it was all built with ancient Egyptian pyramid material from Giza, and it was meant to facilitate the transport of ancient Egyptian building material to build the citadel of Cairo, and here, that would be the citadel here, and to build the walls under Salah ad-Din. And this is a closer view of this bridge, which existed, it must have existed until the 16th century, and still there were remains, little remains of it, when Norden in the late 18th century came and visited the pyramids. His famous view, one can still see the remains, and they have been seen by the scholars of the French expedition. So it was quite a grand building, but it has built all with ancient Egyptian material. And in fact, already at that time, many Muslim authors have criticized the spoliation or the destruction of ancient monuments to build fortification. In Alexandria, the same thing was done, and we know that there were quite critical voices about that. Now, coming to the literature, besides this material legacy, which is either in the survival in the arts, certain artistic continuity, or in the survival of building material in Islamic monuments, sometimes visible, as in the case of the classical heritage, sometimes not visible, like in the case of ancient Egyptian building material. There's another source, perhaps the most important of all, about survival of pre-Islamic Egypt and identity as well in Islamic time. And this is not in the art or in the material culture, but this is mainly in the text. And so we have a tremendous legacy, which we do not see, but we can only read, of Arabic texts, which consist of translation of pre-Islamic texts, as well as Arabic eyewitness accounts by Arabs and by Muslim in geographic, historical, and literature. And then some of them were translations of Greek and Hermetic texts of pre-Islamic that were translated during the translation movement, and they continued to be, they were translated, they were ancient, but they continued to be transmitted and copied by all historians and became part of the general world history. You have always in all books of history a big introduction or of the pre-Islamic past. And of course, you cannot talk about the pre-Islamic past of the Middle East, of the Near East, without mentioning Egypt. And Egypt has played occupies a very prominent place in this literature. Some also of the texts describing ancient monuments or dealing with ancient monuments were are said to have been transmitted or are believed to have been transmitted by oral traditions that continued for a while to exist also, or apparently to be alive among the Coptic population. But unfortunately we do not have, unless I'm wrong, please let me know, Coptic texts referring to the vestiges of ancient Egypt. Although the image of the pharaoh in the Quran is that of an evil king, the plethora of texts of ancient Egypt express unanimously fascination and wonder for a land of magic and marvels. The pyramids were praised as standing for eternity. Among the poems composed in the Islamic period, there is one which says, "The human fears time, but time fears the pyramids." And in the 12th century, an Egyptian of Moroccan origin, Abu Ja'far al-Idrisi, authored a book on the pyramids. This was a study based on his many visits, together with other scholars, to discuss the origin and architecture of the pyramids. To avert any religious suspicion, Idrisi justified his interest with a reference to the Quran, which incites the believers to contemplate the past and the vestiges of bygone civilization and learn from them the morale about the futility of this world, and thus in order to acknowledge God's almight. And there were many, and the Egyptologist Hakim has said there is described in his book about these survivals that there's a kind of an Egyptian Islamic, there's an Islamic Egyptology already in the medieval period because of these people who wanted to study the ancient Egyptian, Egypt, its history and its culture. And one of the most fascinating eyewitnesses is not Egyptian himself, it's Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who came in Egypt at the beginning of the 13th century from Iraq. And he was a physician. And he describes in detail, he has been by many acknowledged as the first Egyptologist ever. He describes in detail and with great originality and acumen many antique sites he visited, he inspected, he looked at mummies and inspected and explored what they were made from. And he had a great deal of admiration for the ancient Egyptian antiquities, in particular the Sphinx. He dedicated a whole chapter, a full paragraph about the beauty of its proportion. And he was very critical of the Ayyubis at that time, rulers who were destroying buildings for the building material. He was very critical for that. And he describes that certain and he says himself, part of history or historical monuments are part of nature. They are part of the world. They are part of the human environment, and therefore they need to be studied, which is a very interesting way of putting this. History and ancient history is part of our world, like nature, and it needs to be studied. And in fact, in the famous 15th century Egyptian historian al-Maqrizi, who described Cairo, that the big book on Cairo, the Khitat, and also on Egypt. He has a big section of his book about ancient Egyptian sites, and again about the pyramid. Suyuti the 15th century scholar and religious man, very orthodox, had a whole book on the pyramids based on texts and old texts of the past. In Makriz, we find a text where he said a poem, putting here in the translation form: if kings wish their power to be remembered, they should speak the language of architecture. Do you not see how the pyramids stand while the kings have vanished? Great monuments reveal the greatness of statue. And the funny statues, this strange thing is that this poem, he doesn't say the author, but the author was an Umayyad caliph of Cordoba. And he wanted to build a big monument, Madinat al-Zahra, and he was criticized for spending too much money. And then he is said to have, he's reported to have composed this poem to say you need great monuments to show greatness. You have to understand that. So the pyramids, this shows how the pyramids and the were conceived of or seen as an example also for Muslim rulers to make themselves to become famous and to have a great legacy. And of course, the pyramids, you couldn't escape them. They were there everywhere. And in the past, when Cairo was much smaller, you could see, I suppose, the pyramid from many places from Cairo. Besides, the pyramid, they also played a great role in the representation of the courtly life. We know that the Mamluk sultans used to go out and have excursions at the foot of the pyramid. They made feasts and festivities there. And it was common in the Mamluk period that travelers and ambassadors and people who came to visit Egypt, they were taken to a tour to the pyramids, and people would watch pyramid climbers. So the pyramids, like the German scholar Ulrich Hamann said, they represented in the ancient, there was a kind of national pride about them. And Sultan al-Ghul, he used to have salons where gatherings with literature gathering with educated people to speak about all kinds of the world, and they discussed the pyramids and how they were made, who made them, and so on. And it was common knowledge in medieval Egypt that the pyramids were made for burial. So this was known in Egypt anyway, and in the Arabic Islamic literature. However, it is there's another completely different aspect of the survival, and perhaps the most intimate one, of ancient Egypt or pre-Islamic Egypt in the Islamic time. And this is in the field of occultism, of magic. Ancient Egypt was always associated, I mean, to the present day, with occult science and with mystery. And this is back to the hermetic sciences that would be too far to discuss here, but that were Greek, mixture of Greek and Egyptian legacy that was strong impregnated with magic, with astrology, and everything esoteric. So, I mean, today we know a little bit less in modern time when we talk about the curse of the pharaohs, when people touch too much or possess or come in too close contact with ancient Egyptian objects and things. And the other side of it is that there was a belief that ancient Egyptian temples and monuments and the hieroglyphs, that they had magic powers, and among these magic powers also apotropaic powers, protective powers, not only negative powers. And for this reason, we find that we know that the examples we have are from the Mamluk period, that, for example, the monastery of Amir Shaykhu, built in the 1350s, it was just after the Black Death, or during the time almost of the Black Death. It has a lintel taken from an ancient Egyptian temple. And this was a monastery. And there is great this was not by chance, and it was, I think it must have been made, and we know where it came from. It must have been had some kind of apotropaic protective power. And we found something, this is, I think, a monastery in Suhag, I think at Dir al-Ahmar, if I'm not wrong, where something similar it can be seen also at the entrance of the monastery. But also, almost all Mamluk mosques used to have a threshold made, taken visibly from ancient Egyptian temples. There were many more in the 1940s, and they were all removed and taken to the Islamic Museum. There is no text that refers to this phenomenon or to this custom, but evidently it's always the frequency and the use of these stones in lintels indicate that they were and they were put such as you can tell where they came from. You can see the hieroglyphs on them. They are not used on the other side that just as building material. These are meant as apotropaic objects for protection. But the texts don't say, because it is a very controversial, it is not Islamic, and as this kind of beliefs are always not accepted by religion. For example, in this sarcophagus, which is now in the British Museum, used to be in Cairo. It has a long history in Cairo, always associated with magic, and it was put in. It used to be in a fountain, or served in a fountain near a mosque, which is here depicted by Luigi Maya, but very, very free interpretation. And we can see it here. And there are many travelers who have seen it. Turkish travelers in the Chalabi described that it used to swim in the Nile back and forth, never stopping and never ending. And until one day, one Egyptian ruler had it stopped. Edward Lenz said in the 19th century, the manners and custom of modern Egyptians, that it was the day of Ashura, that the devils came, or jinns used to come and sell fruits to people, and when people would buy, it was believed that when people would buy these things, they would become rich because they would be made of gold, and so on. A lot of occultism and magic beliefs are associated with objects from ancient Egypt, healing power and not healing power. And this why it was a very controversial subject, and the whole population and the scholars were divided, had divided opinion. And in fact, this is, we have, for example, the whole science of astrology and alchemy in the Middle Ages was associated with ancient Egypt. I have been inspired by Kashan Rari's book, where he has shown this manuscript. Here it is, the temple of Akhmim is mentioned, and you can see in the connection of astrology. And here ancient Egyptian motifs in combination with alchemy. So and these elements, this occult memory, belong also part to the early history of Sufism in Egypt. The Sheikh Zunnun in the 9th century came from Akhmim, which has it's very famous temple there, and eventually the temple was demolished and apparently in the 14th century, because people came, this is what Maqdisi tells us, because people associated the mystic Sheikh Zunnun with the temple and said that he read the hieroglyphs and that he was inspired by them. So this is something that the scholars could not accept, and it led to demolition. The opinions was also about this occult issues divided between the scholars themselves. Maqdisi, for example, thought that the fact that the Sphinx, a sheikh, the Sphinx lost its nose when a fanatic sheikh went together with his followers and demolished it. And he said ever since there has been plenty of sand and the whole statue was drowned under sand. And this was because he believed in the positive, powerful of the Sphinx. And he said then after the demolition of the nose, the sand, the area was drowned in sand. And another, his contemporary, the historian Ibn Dukmak, was quite the opposite of the opposite opinion, and he was very happy when a Mamluk emir went and destroyed a statue that was near standing, an ancient Egyptian statue that was left to stand near the Nile because it was believed to promote the flood, the Nile, the yearly Nile flood. And when it was destroyed, Ibn Dukmak was very happy that this had been the case. However, Ibn Makrizi says that the fact that that when the Sheikh went in the 14th century to destroy the temple of Akhmim, he says that this has led to the man's immediate and sudden death. So we say it is not necessarily popular versus intellectuals or educated or not educated people. The line of division about the meanings of whether magic or not magic is associated with ancient Egypt went through across the population and across even dividing even the historians and the intellectuals. Especially the Akhmim temple, where Sheikh Zunnun had, with which he is associated, because he came from the city. He was a great mystic, and he was associated with reading the hieroglyphs, as I said, and of being of having even been inspired of them. So the Akhmim temple remained a place where scholars used to meet at that time, and scholars who were occupied with astrology and alchemy and all this occult aspect. We know, for example, when Sultan Nasser Muhammad, now just a moment. Okay. So there are many examples of this beliefs in the magic power. For example, when Sultan Nasser Muhammad brought columns from the from the temple of Ashmunain for his palace complex in the citadel, one of the historians says that these columns, which were very difficult to transport, made of granite and very heavy, and he said these columns were not made by human beings. They had been ordered by the priests of the ancient Egyptian temples, and the priests had commissioned jinns or devils or supernatural creatures to produce them, and they produced them with a very special material. These were not done by human beings. So this is, as I said, another example of this belief in magic power that went across even as far high as at the court. However, a remarkable thing, and one of the questions also I've often been asked, what about the survival or the influence of ancient Egypt, of pharaonic Egypt on Islamic art? And there's practically, I'm always surprised when I have to answer, so there's practically nothing. And I'm still amazed that the wealth of ancient Egyptian capitals, which are very interesting and beautiful, and they will be seen everywhere, because first of all, in the Middle Ages, there were many more monuments visible than it is the case today, and people knew them, and they were in the vicinity from Cairo, not far from there, and Cairo itself has consumed a great deal of stones taken from ancient buildings. So in the Middle Ages still, there was, you could not escape the ancient Egyptian past, its ruins, its vestiges, and so on. And yet there is no influence. Why none of the capital, the wealth of ancient Egyptian capitals has inspired capitals in Islamic architecture. People have continued to use or reuse or imitate the Greco-Roman ones. There's only one exception, And it is in a loggia, which is in the middle of Old Cairo. It is all what remains from a palace. In this loggia called a Maq'an Mamai. Mamai was the emir who built it in the late 15th century. And it has capitals which are bespoke. They were made for this loggia. They were not taken from ancient buildings. And this is the only, or almost the only example I can tell of an imitation of ancient Egyptian motif in an Islamic building. And I interpret it because this is late 15th century, when Sultan, and here it is. You can see this close look, and they look very much like the capitals of Edfu. Perhaps there are other models, I don't know. And such columns had been used by Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad more than a century earlier for his palace, which no longer exists. This is by the scholars of the French expedition, and this is imaged by Hayes, the huge, magnificent palace, which Muhammad Ali destroyed also to build his own palace there. And evidently it was always described as something magnificent, and it has this kind of capitals. And I suppose when more than a century later, Mamai built his palace in the city, he was looking at these columns which he wanted to imitate. So this is the only example, or almost the only example, of an ancient Egyptian motif being copied in Islamic art and architecture. The other case, or two cases, has to be accompanied by a question mark. You have here the tip, the upper structure of the minaret of Sultan Qalawun, repaired by his son, or this part was done by his son in the early 14th century, exactly 1303 after the earthquake. And you have this kind of reed motif, which recalls, or is said to recall, ancient Egyptian reed cavetto, as you can see here. And the similar pattern was used 3 decades later in the Mosque of Amir Sheikhu in the 1340s, which showing also these motifs. Are these inspired by ancient Egypt or by the ancient Egyptian cavetto motif, or is it pure accidental? I cannot tell you, and I'm not sure if anyone can tell. Possibly. Why not? So this is now how to explain here is this ancient Egyptian motif. You see it in decorative art on a smaller scale, and stela in decorative objects, and also in architecture. It is quite possible that this might have inspired the two cases I have just shown you. So now this how to explain this absence or lack of interest and for ancient Egyptian art and material culture, whereas at the same time you have this enormous fascination as it is written in the sources, and you have the obsession with the arts, with the occult and magic aspect of ancient Egypt. How it's difficult to combine the two. On one hand, the great fascination with ancient Egypt, and the other, not the least survival of inspiration from ancient Egyptian visual culture, very much unlike the case of Iran. Iran was also a country with a great past, a great pre-Islamic civilization, but it has never abandoned even the obsession with its Sasanian kings through the entire Islamic period, and they are present in all the arts, and to the present day in all the visual arts of Iran. And then it's of course not necessarily in the mosque, no, not, but in all other decorative arts and in architecture and so on. There's nothing like this in as far as Egypt is concerned. And my personal speculation is that it's a speculation. It is the fact that ancient Egypt was so closely associated with magic, with occult, with things that are unorthodox from the religious viewpoint, probably not only from the Muslim viewpoint, Christian as well, because magic and superstitions are not accepted by any, would not have been accepted by the Christian religion either. So I think that this is maybe the reason why ancient Egypt has been avoided in the visual art of Islamic Egypt. But well, think with me and let me know. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Doris Behrens-Abouseif, for being with us, and thank you for giving us this. It's very wonderful lecture, tracing those pre-Islamic motifs in Islamic art and architecture and texts. I think it's a wonderful topic. And
thank you very much, Sarah, for your kind words.
Well, thank you. And I'm sure I can say on behalf of everyone at the EES, we are very excited to explore more into this topic and Islamic Egyptian
history. If anyone
history.
has any questions, they can also write to me, and I'll be glad to help to reply.
Thank you so much, Doris. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and I will do my usual membership plug. We can only host these free lectures for you from the support of our members. Our membership year is starting next month from the 1st of April. So if you're already a member, please do renew. Your magazine will be coming very soon. If you're not yet a member, join now to get nearly a month free. So I hope to welcome you into the community soon. So once again, thank you so much, Doris. And
my pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.